after a quick intro and the necessary security script that we are all required to read here at CSIS for the benefit of all. So let's see here. I am your designated security officer in the unlikely event of a lightning strike, natural disaster, whatever. In the event of emergency, we appreciate your full cooperation. We'll ask everybody to exit through the front glass doors here or through the back if necessary. Everybody's going to meet either across the street at St. Matthew's Cathedral or back at National Geographic. We'll bring ice cream. We'll continue the event there in the rain. It'll be lovely. But more to the point, we are here to get a preview of Humphrey Hawksley's new book, Asian Waters, The Struggle Over the South China Sea and the Strategy of Chinese Expansion. And by way of biography, I'm just going to read the biography in the jacket because that seems the one most approved. So Humphrey Hawksley is a BBC correspondent whose face and voice are known to millions. He is the author of numerous titles, including Democracy Kills, What's So Good About Having the Vote, which is a tie-in to a documentary about the pitfalls of the modern-day path to democracy from dictatorship. He's written for The Guardian, The Times, Financial Times, the International Herald Tribune, and other publications. And what's not captured there is that most, maybe all, of that writing was in Asia.
Yes.
Spent time in China and Singapore, I believe.
China, Singapore, Philippines, India, Sri Lanka, Beijing,
A pretty wide swath.
It's Asia.
And so with that, we're going to go to a brief presentation by Humphrey, and then I'll lead a short moderated discussion, and then what we really want to do is hear questions from the audience. So with that.
Okay,
Humphrey.
Do I go here? Or
you can use the podium.
I think, because I can see that more clearly. Yeah, that we're on the right. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you, Greg. I just want to say before we begin here that you opened up your images, your books, and your knowledge to me, everybody at CSIS, and without that, this book would not be half as good. And it's also quite humbling coming here, because I've just come from Great Britain, which 2 years ago voted to leave the European Union. So I've come from now little England, which seems to be a 1,000-year-old country chasing some lost dream, to the heart of an empire that's defining a new ideology. And I'm not quite sure where it's going to end up, whether it's somewhere between Trumpology and the Thucydides trap, will be somewhere. There's an era of echo chambers that's happened with our social media and everything, where everybody gets on this platform to hear about what they want to hear about and not hear about what other people want to hear about. And this happened just recently with the publication of the book, because what you're seeing up there is the South China Sea issue as seen by my New York publishers. It's pastel, it's nuanced, it's not too harsh, and as Greg said, it's the struggle over the South China Sea and the strategy for Chinese expansion. This is how it's seen from London. Red, harsh, dark lines, fighter planes, aircraft. And then a couple of weeks ago, I got a call from the publisher saying, we've got a problem in the Asian sales teams. I said, what on earth can that be? They said they won't be selling the book in some areas that has South China Sea in the title. And I thought, uh-oh. And that took me by surprise, because I traveled around. I said, well, everybody uses it. ASEAN uses it. Everybody uses it. I said, that's not the point. These guys have got to be enthusiastic about the book, so we've got to change the title. I said, well, why don't we call it Indo-Pacific then, because that's fashionable now. And they said, well, I guess that's okay, but nobody knows what the hell that is. So we stuck. I said, okay, let's do Asia-Pacific. And that is what it is. And in fact, it's a slightly better in a way, because when the book was conceived a couple of years ago, the South China Sea was just there. But now it's spread out. And we've seen where China's influence is and how people are either accepting it or pushing back on it. So just to make sure we're all in the same echo chamber for this one, there's a map of the South China Sea. There's the NineDash Line, or cow's tongue, as it's called locally, particularly in Vietnam, where it sort of loops around like that. And you've got, I think I've got a laser here, you've got 7 new Chinese military bases there in the Spratly Islands. You've got dispute up in the Scarborough Shoal there between the Philippines and China, nothing built yet, but a lot going on. And then you've got the renovation there in the Paracel Islands, of Woody Island base, mainly to renovate a new base there. The Paracel Islands, it was taken from Vietnam on 2 occasions. In 1956, peacefully by China, took part of it. And then in 1974, they went in with loss of Vietnamese life and took the other part of it. Both those dates are interesting in the way that China deals with things, in that in 1956, of course, Vietnam was just recovering from Dien Bien Phu and the expulsion of the French. And in 1974, South Vietnam was about to fall to the North Vietnamese. So that both those times the country was particularly vulnerable. This is Woody Island, which has been, Greg is much more knowledgeable about what is there and what isn't there, but basically this is a military, air, naval, possibly a missile base. And there was many Chinese officials that I've sort of talked to about this, but one of them said to me, "Why are you so angry about the South China Sea? Why are we getting criticized so much about the South China Sea?" And I started talking about the rule of law and this, that, and the other. And then I stopped. I said, no, the reason that I'm sort of want to talk to you guys about it is because you beat up the poor people. You go after the fishermen. And we don't like, in the media, big powers beating up small people. And this guy is a Vietnamese fisherman, Vo Van Gogh, who in 2014, when the Chinese and the Vietnamese were at odds with each other, he was dragged from his boat, beaten senseless with mallets and fishing equipment, then thrown back onto his boat again, and then that boat was rammed by a Chinese Coast Guard, so it had to be towed back to shore. And then on the other side, that's Scarborough Shoal there, which is well inside the Philippines' exclusive economic zone. And the Philippine fishermen have been fishing there for centuries. They talk about their grandfathers and all the rest of it. You see, incidentally, there, that lagoon. Oops. Where are we? Oh. Sorry about this. There we go. This lagoon, Scarborough Shoal, it's only got one entrance there, which makes it a very particularly sort of that's where the Chinese put their Coast Guard boats so that nobody can get in. So this guy's name is Ulrich Osen, and in 2012, when the Scarborough Shoal thing blew up, he was water cannoned twice by the Chinese and thrown off his boat into the sea. And that was when the Philippine fishermen were told they couldn't fish there anymore. And then he became something of a very intrinsic part of what is now this sort of global shift of regional power that's been going on in Southeast Asia. Now, his village is called Masinloc, and the Scarborough Shoal is called Bayou de Masinloc, which means Lower Masinloc, and his village is Masinloc up in northern Luzon. And it's a community that's harboring a way of life that we all know can't exist, can't go on any longer. It's a bit like the old steel towns, the old mill towns of Britain. And if you look at his boat there, it's made of bamboo and wood and tied together with God knows what. Lots of colors, completely bereft of technology, no refrigeration for the fish. But when he was told that he couldn't fish anymore, it took the lifeblood out of the village. The men couldn't work. And as they got more and more poor, they sent their wives to Saudi Arabia as domestic helpers. So you just imagine what that does to a community. And then, as they were sort of suffering, their lives turned upside down, Rodrigo Duterte came to power, and he asked the American ambassador, Manila, so I'm told by a Philippine official, about Scarborough Shoal, and was told bluntly, we're not going to go to war over a fishing reef. Then Duterte got on a plane with a bunch of businessmen and went to Beijing to cut deals. One of those deals was that the Chinese invest in infrastructure of what it's doing all over the world, and he came out of that saying that that the Philippines' future lay not in the United States, which is its oldest ally, but in China. And it was Duterte, and he can change his mind and flip-flop at any time, but that was a public statement that was not good to hear from our point of view. When I talk about us, I talk about the sort of Western democracies. And a senior Philippine diplomat told me that the president also made it clear to the Chinese that if they wanted that to continue, they had to see the fishermen right in Scarborough Shoal. So what they did was that they flew to his village a guy from the Ministry of Fisheries that took a bunch of fishermen, not him, to Beijing and Guangzhou to show them how a modern fishing industry worked. They came back starry-eyed. They then said, look, whatever you catch, we're going to buy, so you don't have to hawk it around the market anymore. Oh, and by the way, you can go and fish there again. So I met him. He'd just come back from a week of fishing, where he earned 10 times what he was doing as a shopkeeper or a cyclo driver and that sort of thing. And he had a spring in his step again, because these people were put on the earth to fish. They weren't put on their earth to ride cyclos or work in supermarkets. And more importantly, they could bring the wives back from Saudi Arabia and be a community again. So underneath all the talk of war and blood in sand and everything like that, you've got a microcosm there of what China is doing all over Southeast Asia and probably beyond. This stick and carrot approach, reward and punishment. And that's why the South China Sea is sort of so important, because it's a example of that. Now, the first story I did there for television was back in 1995 when these appeared on Mischief Reef. And it was difficult to get it on air. I think we got it on the main news network once, and then everybody forgets about it. And then, this is 2012, Mischief Reef again, one of AMTI's photos, followed in 2017 by this. And here you've got the hangars, the runways, all of the stuff. So it's gone from being largely forgotten, nobody doing much about it, to being a fully fledged military base. Now in 2016, before this photo was taken, an international court at The Hague described all this basically as being illegal. It's against international law. What did China do? It kept building them. Kept putting in better weaponry, better planes, better hangars. What it hasn't done is it hasn't said, oh, I'm sorry, I've broken the law. We'll take it all down and start again. That hasn't happened. So here in the South China Sea, you have this big test of international law, and our conundrum is what to do about it. If China gets away with this here, and it has got away with it here, what is it going to do in the Indian Ocean? In the Arctic, which is melting, in the Mediterranean, where it now owns ports in Greece and in Italy. What is it going to do in the Atlantic, where it tried to buy a military base in Greenland and was stopped at the last moment by the Danish government? And what could any anti-Western government, or any pro-Western government for that matter, do when it wants to do something using the South China Sea issue as a precedent? That's the conundrum that we haven't yet faced. And we're not yet facing it properly. I was at a conference a couple of days ago here in Washington where the deputy ambassador, Li Ke-shun, gave a keynote speech. And like a tongue on a sore tooth, he started off with what I think many of you will be familiar with, this term, the century of humiliation. That's the 110 years from 1839 to 1949 that China considered to have been colonized and humiliated by the West, and the Opium Wars. And when I talk about it, and I suspect there's one or two in the audience now, thinking like this, eyes start rolling, like when you talk about poverty in India. Oh, this is just the way that they're shoring up support for the Communist Party and the one-party state, and that's just, we've got to ignore it. I advise against that. That might be true, but this idea of the century of humiliation is in the minds of every Chinese from childbirth. It's high on the school curriculum, big in the universities, big across the family dinner tables. And this is a bunch of school children at the Opium War Museum, where the British troops actually came ashore near Guangzhou in 1839. This is a very well-funded museum. At the entrance is the picture of a young woman, vivacious and healthy, who's taken a bit of opium, and gets dour and listless, and then finally collapses. This is what, in order to balance its books, the East India Company was trying to do to China in the 1830s with its gunboats and opium trade, seen through the eyes of the Chinese in the Chinese echo chamber. Inside the museum, which I found interesting, there's no cover-up of unfairness or anything. It's just the way the world works. So there are displays of the advanced Western technology, which China had escaped China, of telescopes, microscopes there, compasses, and that sort of thing, that enabled the West to defeat China. And there's an interesting phrase, whether it's a mistranslation or not, they called it the democratic governments of the West doing it. They used that word democracy. And there are these huge murals of the gunboats coming ashore, the artillery, and that sort of science that did it, and finally the redcoats smashing their way to victory. The point being, when I was talking in Beijing and to Chinese people about this, is that when we talk to them, or they are lectured by us about the international rule of law and the rules-based system, this was their first taste of it. So they might say, yes, it's great if you can work it for yourself. It makes you rich and it makes you strong. But don't try and tell them that it's fair and equal, because they don't believe that. They will take what they can. And there was one guy, just to put it in a perspective that interested me, he said, imagine this. He said, imagine that America is going through a period of vulnerability. It has an unreliable leader. There's social unrest. It's not quite sure what sort of country it is and where it is going. And imagine at that time that a Mexican drug cartel blasts its way up from the south, demanding that Arizona, California, New Mexico, and Texas open themselves up to cocaine sales. And they force a weakened America to sign a treaty, and they say, look, this is the international rule of law. This is how things are done now. You've got to learn to live with it. That's how it's taught in the Chinese universities and schools, just as there are similar topics that are taught in my school and that, and we go with that. So given that, I think we need to get inside the minds of China and address or understand this concern in the way that we probably didn't get inside the minds of Saddam and the Iraqis. And if we had done that, we might not be in that similar position at the moment. I just want to go up now to, it's about there. Oh, that's where it is. It's off the coast of Da Nang, an island called Lison, which is a community of about 20,000 people, and it's from here that the fishermen go out to the Paracel Islands. So this community here is pretty much, it's a sort of fishing, it's an agricultural community too, but it's got this historical element, and quite interestingly, they have conscription in Vietnam, but if you're a fisherman in Lison, you escape conscription because you're in fact representing the country in the fishing boats. And this character here is Tran Ngoc Nguyen, who's the governor of Lison, and he told me that at least half of the boats that go out to the Paracel Islands in some way come into confrontation with Chinese coast guards or hostile Chinese fishing boats, which is known as the maritime militia of China. I asked him to draw me the NineDash Line, so I put a map in front of him without anything on it. I said, draw me the line. So he drew it along those contours of that cow's tongue there. And when he got to Lison, he pushed the marker down and pressed it right through the center of his island. And I stepped back and I said, look, I haven't seen a map like this. You're exaggerating. The China doesn't make a claim to that. He says, yes, but China doesn't say where the NineDash Line is. And we have to be prepared that they could at any stage come into this island and try and take it from us. And that's what our thinking is. This is a thinking of a sort of mid-ranking government official. It goes right throughout Vietnam, probably right throughout much of Southeast Asia. But then, after a lot of sort of military, Vietnam's more canny at it, but a lot of hostilities, Vietnam too has to cut its deals with China. China's got the economic leverage. It's there on the doorstep. So most recently they announced some setting up of economic zones that caused anti-Chinese demonstrations because it means that more Chinese businesses would go in there. And that went the wrong way. Oh, there we are. One example that came to me, you could go into facts and figures, but this was a striking one, is that they have the National Military Museum in Hanoi. And I've been going backwards and forwards to this museum since the late 80s. And the first time I went there, they had right outside the thing, they had a French, an American, and a Chinese armored personnel carrier tank all stacked up and crushed on top of each other to show that this is the one country that's taken on 3 of the permanent members of the UN Security Council and given them a very bloody nose. Now, if you go there, that's not there anymore. There's no captured Chinese vehicles in the National Military Museum. This is an American plane that was brought down at some time. They've got the maps for the invasion of Saigon and the taking of Saigon in 1975. Nothing about going into Cambodia in 79 and that 78 and 79 and that war there. And then this one is 948, an ancient battle where they had a fight between the Vietnamese and the Chinese. So it's a bit like in Britain, if you go into a museum and we've got 1066 and the Norman invasion and Harold with the eye, with the arrow in his eye, but nothing about the First or the Second World War. They've decided to placate China in that way. Given the essentially what has happened probably over the past 5 or 6 years, that since these bases have been built and the economic leverage has increased, you have this sort of Chinese, it's not control, but big influence in Southeast Asia. And they've been very successful at it. Why? First, there was a failure of both the US and a united Asian front to stop the building of the bases. So that prompts any pragmatic, forward-looking Asian leader to ask where their country's long-term future lies. So 3 or 4 years ago, when I was talking to Southeast Asian governments, they kept saying, we don't want to be asked to choose sides in this. That's what we did in the Cold War. Today, more and more of them are putting together already a plan B, because they know that things are shifting in that direction. Just about every government there has at some stage been given a marker of what would happen to them if they cross Beijing, and this panoply of rewards that float down if they go along with what Beijing wants. What might unfold if China fails to deliver in a number of years, we don't really know, but that's pretty much where we are now. So then we go through the Malacca Straits to India. And this is how the book moved in the 2 years, because India now is a sort of new, not front line, but it's this new ally, not even ally, but it's new partner to stop or balance Chinese expansion. China's already got what's called the string of pearls that runs around a series of ports in the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal there. And now there's this talk about the Quad, which is the US, India, Japan, and Australia. And I've got a feeling that we, Britain and France, will soon be joining that, and I don't know what you call it after that. My problem with this is that we've been there before. And as much as it's talked up about democratic values going against authoritarian values and all that, it's not going to work. And this is why. 1962, China fought a brief war with India in which Kennedy sent immediately US equipment and advisors to help India against China. Again, China went in, as with the Paracels, exactly when it thought the US would be distracted. It timed it to coincide exactly, almost to the day, with the Cuban Missile Crisis. But Kennedy wasn't distracted, and the Cuban Missile Crisis went on. When Kennedy ended the blockade, the Chinese withdrew from India. Having defeated the Indians or shown that they were much better than the Indians militarily, they were also terrified that the US would join in and possibly with nuclear weapons. So one would have thought there was a clear shoulder-to-shoulder alliance of the two world's biggest democracies there that would endure. Not so. 9 years later, when the Bangladesh War of Independence happened, the US sided with Pakistan, and India signed an agreement with China, with Russia, that is now endures very well, and Russia became India's main supplier of arms. So that's pretty much a locked agreement. So if we spool forward 50 years or so, that border problem hasn't gone away. This was last year on the Doklam Plateau with Sikkim, Bhutan, and India, the two armies face to face. And China will keep up this pressure on India on this unresolved border issue, whilst at the same time leveraging its economic and trade leverage inside of India. Why has it unfolded like this? Why are we living in a false premise if we think that India is going to join like this? For three reasons. Unlike other rising global powers, in which I count Britain, China, France, Japan, Russia, the US, India hasn't undergone a massive revolution in whereby you strip out the old system and you install a new one, usually with a great deal of bloodshed, but that's how it tends to happen. What India did was it took what the British bequeathed them and basically ran with it, whether it was the rail system or parliament, and the system has held the country together, but it hasn't produced great policies or great leaders. It hasn't led the world in poverty alleviation, for example, which it could have done, and there aren't really mechanisms or impetus to change it. Secondly, unlike other rising powers, India hasn't introduced its Monroe Doctrine, whereby, like China is doing now, it looks after its own backyard to make sure that other nations don't interfere in it. So over the years, Pakistan we know about, but Sri Lanka, the Maldives, Bangladesh, Nepal, and Bhutan, all of which were technically in India's arc, but it's just let them go. And China is now in there very much. And third, this continuing general lack of trust between the US and India can only ever make them fair with the friends. In a scenario, say, and it might happen tomorrow, whereby the US-Russia relationship worsens and India is asked to choose, as we in Europe are now being asked to choose on the Iran deal that has gone, India will likely head back to its non-aligned status and keep doing its own thing, and not least because it sees Russia as a reliable supplier of arms, whereas the US has not been. I'm just going to finish. I'm not going to touch on Japan or Korea unless we do that in Q&A. But these are two other sort of flashpoints. But I do want to talk about Taiwan a little bit, which in this very bad map is down there just off the coast of China. And I presume we all know pretty much its history. And there we have a Taiwanese-controlled island against that magnificent backdrop of the mega city of Xiamen. It's just a couple of hundred yards or a stone's throw away. And this shows, so Taiwan itself is 100 or so miles away, but Jinmen, which is there, is very, very close. And there's a commuter ferry that I took across to Jinmen, takes half an hour, and it sort of runs backwards and forwards. Now, Jinmen has been for a long time in the crosshairs of China's reunification plans for Taiwan, which seem in recent months or months to have gathered pace. The Deputy Ambassador, Li Chexin, highlighted Taiwan in his keynote address. He went straight off the Opium Wars onto Taiwan, like, let's talk about the things that are really troubling us on this. And he spoke in an uncompromising language about red lines. And the thing about Taiwan is that, Korea, India, South China Sea, these are all sort of strategic ways that you work out your foreign policy and defense policy. Taiwan is right here. There we go, right there. It's an emotional narrative, like the Opium Wars. And the more we understand that emotional narrative, the more we can deal with it. We have to separate our thinking on that away from the other ones, because it does go right to the heart of what every Chinese person is taught at school, and that Xi Jinping, as he gathers his power, is going to stake more and more of his reputation on winning Taiwan back. In 1958, these are the spikes that are still there, some of the islands of Jinmen, so that Chinese paratroopers would be impaled if they tried to invade, and they would land on those spikes and then get machine gunned by Taiwanese troops and guerrillas. And this, in 1958, Mao was so determined to take back Jinmen that he unleashed such a ferocious artillery barrage that the US moved nuclear weapons in to carry out a strike around Xiamen. Khrushchev, who was then the newly appointed leader of the Soviet Union, got wind of it and told Eisenhower that a strike on China would be a strike on the Soviet Union. Eisenhower was in any case a little reluctant, and he had to tell his commanders that the nuclear weapon was a different type of weapon. It wasn't like, oh, we're going to battle, let's use the best gun we've got. There was something different here. And I think there's an argument way outside this that perhaps the same thing should be done now with cyber warfare. But Taiwan was, in a way, a forerunner of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And, of course, by the time that happened, the Sino-Soviet pact had shredded a bit, which was why Beijing probably backpedaled from India so quickly in 1962. The most strategic island in the South China Sea is this one here, Dongsha, because you can see exactly where it lies at the mouth of the South China Sea. And that is owned by the Taiwanese. It's demilitarized, it's got the coast guards there, and I flew in there a few years back. That's what it looks like from a transport plane. And there we are doing a piece to camera trying to explain Asia to our audience in 2 minutes. And that's basically all it is. It's a runway and a couple of, there's a coral place that they grow coral and the housing for the coast guards. And I think there's some pretty heavy weaponry on there that we weren't allowed to see. There's been some talk on the Twitter sphere nonsense, another echo chamber recently, about US troops being posted to the Taiwanese islands in the Spratlys, which obviously is not going to happen. But in Taipei, there is talk about remilitarizing Dongsha and Taiping, which is the other island there, which is the big one in the Spratlys. And that would be one hell of a red line if Taiwan chose to cross it. But it's obviously putting on a table a bit because it's talking about it. And then, of course, if China did walk into Dongsha one day, its control of the South China Sea would be complete strategically. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Russian bastion of defense on the other side, but it would be similar to the Russians walking into Spitsbergen and Svalbard there, and then they would own all that territory there heading into the North Atlantic. The Taiwanese gave me some figures on maintaining these islands, which I thought were quite useful. They modernized Taiping recently, and reckoned it cost them 1.1 billion to modernize it. That's new runway, new port, and all the rest of it. Meaning that if you take into account the cost of reclaiming the land and building the 8, the parasols, and the 7 in the Spratly Islands, it doesn't come cheap. So where does this leave us in the South China Sea? I think it possibly leaves us with that image of Taiwan, because Taiwan has become a successful, developed economy and democracy under US mentorship since 1949. It's been rocky in a day, but when they did it, there was no loss of life. Yet today, salami slice by salami slice, China's squeezing Taiwan. It's from military exercises into trade, into the international isolation. The plan is essentially to make life so difficult there that eventually a Taiwanese government gets elected and says to hell with it, we better reunify with them, and it would be better. The problem is that we're not doing much to stop it, because it doesn't, it's not like an IED in Iraq. It's sort of very slow and incremental. 1, 2. Sorry about that. And after the failure of Iraq and the misconceptions about the Arab Spring, the reputation of liberal democracy, for want of a better word, being damaged in the view of some beyond repair, particularly if you're in Beijing at times, Taiwan, along with South Korea, stands as examples of that democracy can work outside of a Western culture. If you mentor it properly, if you give it time, and if you give patience, you can do it. Yet what we're doing, we're faced with a situation now where China's become rich and confident, using that international rules-based order that it doesn't really trust, and it's taking the wealth of that system to destroy one of the great examples of democracy in another culture that we have managed to create. I'm not sure what we do about that, but when you look at the flashpoints, so you've got the India-China border, you've got Korea, you've got Japan, and you've got the South China Sea. Taiwan, I've got a feeling now that the Korean issue has been shelved for a few months at least, will come under the spotlight a little bit more. And I'll just finish with this memo from the Australian Joint Intelligence Committee in 1959. And I'm going to read it because if we ignore problems like this, they come and bite us very quickly, and we don't know what to do about it. No one's trained, and this is one. We know what China's going to do. We know where it's going in the Arctic. We know where it wants to go in Europe. We know what it's doing in Africa. But we don't seem to have a cohesive policy to address it. I'm not saying to stop it, but to address and understand it. So in 1959, the Australian Joint Intelligence Committee flagged up a memo. This is 59. If in the longer term the Communist Chinese were to develop the islands militarily, they could make a nuisance out of themselves on the international shipping and air routes on the pretext of infringements of territorial waters and airspace, and might even shoot down an aircraft occasionally. At that stage, Australia wanted either Britain or the US to take control of the Spratlys and the Paracels, but of course that fell on deaf ears because there was Suez, there was Korea, there was Cuba around the corner, and all the rest of it. I'll leave you with that. If we want to talk about Japan and Korea later on, that's fine, but back to you, Greg. Thank you.
Thanks. Well, Humphrey, thanks very much for the quick abstract of the book. There's still plenty more in there that he didn't talk about, I promise. I encourage you. At the risk of throwing out any spoilers, I would suggest that there was something to the decision by the British publishers to remove the South China Sea from the title. Because when reading the book, I'm struck by the fact that this is less a book about the South China Sea and more a book about China. It is a book, it seems, about the rise of China using the South China Sea as a jumping off point. Is that a fair assessment?
I think so. I think when it was first being thought about, I was actually asking myself, how can I write an interesting book about rocks and reefs and tidal flows and international law that's going to sustain 300 pages? And my colleague, Bill Hayton, has done one that I couldn't beat anyway. I took one look at Bill's book and I thought, well, there's no way I'm going to do better than that. But then as time went on, I thought, well, this is about these things, but it's how cleverly China is doing it, in that the way that it operates, and we're seeing it operate in Europe. I'm doing a similar thing in this about China in Europe next week. In Europe, is that it will never do enough for anybody to say, hey, we've really got to stop this. So, and you've been tracking this, Greg, and you think, well, okay, so they put missiles in there, so what are we going to do? Okay, so they built a runway. Well, it's not worth going to war over a fishing reef. This is what they're doing. And then I was looking more closely, and things were developing, is what is happening up in Japan with the Senkaku Islands? What is happening over in India on the border there? What is the economic leverage that China is putting into Eastern Europe at the moment in order to split the European Union, which isn't in the book, but it's sort of emerged, since then. So I was looking at what is China's long-term plan? Why didn't we know or address some of this on the South China Sea issue, which is hotly debated? Where do we stop it? Do we want to stop it? And how do we address it? And when you talk to the governments in the West, there's always something happening somewhere else that is more important than something that China has deliberately kept below the parapet.
Well, that leads into an interesting point, which is that there's probably more ink spilled in this book on India and on Japan, and certainly on the US and on Taiwan than there is on the Philippines or on Vietnam. There are not chapters about the other Southeast Asian claimants that are mentioned, which raises the question in your mind, what is the role of the Southeast Asian claimants? They almost seem like bit actors in their own maritime disputes.
I think that they're the primary actors in a way, but they've shown, I think, as I mentioned, that they've had, say, since 1975, an opportunity under the Australian security umbrella to become cohesive enough, uncorrupt enough, decisive enough, to recognize in a way that at some stage there will be a rise of China and that they need to be a unit to do it. Well, that hasn't happened, and we saw that when Cambodia split away on the ASEAN thing and on other things. And now, as we thought with the Philippines and Duterte, they're picking off these countries one by one. Even Singapore was targeted when it was having its joint military exercises with Taiwan a couple of years back, and its armored carriers were confiscated in Hong Kong. So you had 3 hits at once about Chinese control there. And what I think, to answer your question directly, is I thought, okay, we have the story of the Philippines and Vietnam, which are the 2 main ones. The other ones would be, if you're looking at the broader campus, kind of repetitive. And I didn't want to go into the huge corruption, although I mentioned it a bit, in the Malaysian politics or the inward workings of Indonesia, which is hugely important.
Fair enough. Yeah. Now I want to ask an unfair question.
Please.
What's the South China Sea all about? Because let me open this with you. One of the final chapters, chapter 16 or so, is called The Heart of the Matter, where one would expect to see what the heart of the matter is. I'm not sure there's a definitive answer, though. You open the chapter by mentioning at the center of the dispute are conflicts over trade, freedom of navigation, taxation, which I'd be interested in. That one caught my surprise, and international law. And those, some mix of that same soup is usually what comes out in statements. But we've still failed to explain to publics, even in Asia, what exactly this is about. We keep throwing out those buzzwords, but one of them has to be at the forefront.
Well, I guess it's about the rules-based system in international law. And for me, I think it's where you should draw the line and put the spotlight. So if we say Iraq in 2003 was against, was about democracy and ending threats and that sort of, this is a different way of saying, yeah, there's something very important going on here. And if we are to uphold the value system that we've fought for over the years, and we call it liberal democracy over in Britain, and that's getting trashed. I don't know what the fashionable term for it is here, but the D-Day beaches, the mission of the D-Day beaches, are we going to let it be salami sliced away by an authoritarian, powerful government that is going to win the allies of Asia, win the weaker countries of Europe, win the countries of Africa? And the place that it's made its stand, and it's blatantly violated international law, is in the South China Sea. The problem we've got there, Greg, I think, is that nobody lives there. So that you don't have the sort of pictures that you got down on the Mexican border, you don't have the sort of pictures you get out of Syria, you don't get that sort of prairie fire of emotion of saying, oh my God, we've got to do something here. And there are issues that are now very complex, given what is happening in the States, here in the US now politically, and what we've got happening in Europe and Britain politically. People are bringing up their plan Bs as to what is the best system of government, particularly if you're sitting in the Philippines or Malaysia or something, when you have this huge foot right on top of you, that you're going to have to deal with this, to deal with it. So I'm not going to be prescriptive here, but I think I'm just saying that we've got to be aware that this is happening and find a way to sell it so that the people that make the decisions at the top can allocate the time and money to deal with it.
Well, by not being prescriptive, you short-circuit my follow-up question, which was, what do we do about it?
I'll make an allowance for that.
Okay. I understand that there's an entire cottage industry, and I'm part of it here in Washington, making up answers to this question. But in your opinion, what exactly should the parties you mentioned, not just the U.S., but India and Japan and Korea and the Southeast Asians, do about this?
I think my overall prescription goes a little wider, and actually it was here at a CIS thing when I first started doing this on China Power that there were a number of Chinese people and there, and we got into a conversation as, has there ever been a conference to remold the world order without there being a war? And we sort of talked about the Congress of Vienna, the League of Nations, and all the rest of it. And none of us could actually say that yes, so there's been this one, and that lasted for X number of years. I think what we're facing here is the creaking architecture of a 70-year-old system that isn't doing the business. It's not doing the business in the European Union. It's not doing business at the United Nations, and various other multilateral things are not doing. And even if it was doing the business, it's not trusted. That was the point I was trying to get there. It's not trusted by China because it sees the Western-based international rules system as being delivered through the barrel of a gun in 1839. This will never happen because nations do not concede ground that is not lost on the battlefield. But it would be quite interesting if you set a conference with around and saying, if we had a war, how would we rewrite this world order? Who would get the seat at the table, and what would it look like? I'm not even being prescriptive on that because I know that is never going to happen, but I think that is what needs to happen at some stage. Otherwise, you're going to get a black swan come up, and everybody's going to look around and they say, oh my God, this has happened, and now we're going to have a war.
I think we have a pretty good idea of what Beijing's vision for a post, World War II international order, what the system would look like in the next couple of decades. And whether you want to look at it as Asian values, reviving that debate from the 90s, or Xi Jinping's China dream, there is a sense, reading the press releases from Beijing, that China thinks it speaks for Asia here. And I think one of the reasons, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you focus so much on Taiwan is to make the point that China doesn't necessarily speak for the rest of Asia. Yeah. And that part of the problem in the South China Sea is that Beijing has failed to come to grips with the idea that the rest of Asia isn't necessarily on board with China's vision for the 21st century.
You're right. But I think that the rest of Asia is wondering what it can do about not being on board. And it's beginning to realize there's not much it can do about not being on board. I often compare the situation in Asia, particularly with Taiwan, with that we've got in the Middle East in the Palestinian issue or something. I think there's a pragmatism in Asia of okay, we've got a big power here, let's find a pragmatic way of dealing with this power so that we can still keep going on. They're not going to send out suicide bombers and get themselves killed and that sort of thing. It's going to be different to that. But what will happen, I think, is this easing of Western values out, particularly if we let Taiwan go, because that I think, and that's why I mentioned those two things there, because one, you've got the rule of law or the value system or whatever that is militarily symbolized by the South China Sea, and then you've got right on its doorstep Taiwan, which is a success story of how our values can work in Asia. And that is what, and I think the Chinese too are pragmatic enough to think, okay, so we've now got a proper argument and a proper thing against it's not going to be picked on steel or on a freedom of navigation operation. We've got an overarching policy here, and we can deal with that policy as long as it doesn't interfere with the trajectory of where we want to go in the next 30 or 40 years. I mean, China's got big problems of its own, and it knows right now that it needs us more than we need it, to put it very bluntly. But at the same time, it has got, this emotional thing about Taiwan where it could lash out to its own detriment if it feels its sovereignty is being impinged, a bit like we're doing in Britain at the moment. So, this is what makes it quite delicate.
Well, with that, I'm going to wrap up and throw it to the audience. We're going to have a microphone coming around. I would just lay down a couple of ground rules. Please identify yourself so Humphrey knows who's responding to. Please make sure that your question involves a question. Speeches and grandstanding are what we're up here for. All right, and with that, I have one in the back here, 2, 3 up front.
Stanley Kober. I keep hearing that the Chinese will be able to control South China Sea, but these are fixed targets, no civilians. That's tailor-made for the American Armed Forces if we get into a conflict. We can destroy anything. So I'm wondering what value is there in terms of a US-China confrontation and what they're getting out of this. You started off with the fish. Okay, they get fish. This is a big investment just to get some fish. I'm still puzzled.
I think it's a tricky one because they've got no motivation to interfere with the shipping in the South China Sea at all. Insurance rates would go up. They wouldn't be able to get their fuel. There's no motivation to do that. And the US has essentially said, apart from the freedom of navigation operations, which are very choreographed, has said, okay, that's how we are at the moment. I mean, I've spoken to military and defense people who say that they've got control. What concerns me is that China gets a bit of hubris about this and keeps going and oversteps the mark, or that a prairie fire begins here, like say it did with Dubai Ports World, when they wanted to buy a New York port here, and a wave of public opinion comes in that forces the politicians to make decisions that aren't necessarily pragmatic and well thought out. So unless the situation is resolved, which it's not at the moment, and the same goes with Taiwan and all these other issues, you have got a danger of something breaking out that we don't expect to break out. It's a known, as it were, which is why it would be far better to resolve it. But then how do you do that? Do you accept that they've broken international law, and therefore what happens after that? That's what I talk about, the conundrum.
Okay, thank you. Shi Xinzhou from Shanghai Institute for International Studies and a waiting fellow in CSIS. And I don't agree with your say China's policy is a kind of expansion. Maybe China policy is just about the consolidation or enhancement in South China Sea because we hasn't occupied more islands in South China Sea, especially since 2002 after DOC was concluded. 2 questions. First is about, you mentioned about the struggle over South China Sea. You see, Gulf of Thailand is also one part of South China Sea, and also some maritime disputes of some Southeast Asian countries in the Gulf of Thailand. And do you think how, can you say a little more about the Gulf and of Thailand struggles in there? And the second is about the US, not US, the Great Britain, and will conduct freedom of navigation in South China Sea. Do you think Great Britain is trying to humiliate China again? Thank you.
I didn't get the, can you repeat the question again? I didn't quite get it, it kept dropping out.
Can you say something about the maritime disputes in the Gulf of Thailand?
Maritime influence of?
Maritime disputes in the Gulf of Thailand.
In the Gulf of Thailand. Oh, yes. There are, I think the gentleman's talking about the other disputes between the other countries, which there are many. Brunei, Vietnam, I mean, everybody's got a dispute, and the Spratly Islands is disputed between all of these people, and that's not settled. But I think the key point, the narrative that I've got here is that there's not a threat of war on these. There's certainly not a threat of war between superpowers on these. and there's there is structures within ASEAN that keep stuff down. I don't think anybody's got a motivation to blow these up. And I mean, there are disputes between the US and Canada and Japan and Korea, which occasionally we've got Gibraltar and Spain. There are territorial disputes all around the world. The South China Sea dispute, as I say, is interesting because the rule of law, international law, has been broken according to an international court, and that issue of it being broken but not addressed, or the rule of law being implemented, remains unresolved. And that, I think, is the main problem we've got with this.
Up front, in the middle here.
Thanks, Pete Levy from the Australian Embassy. Good to see the Australian intelligence community was on the ball 50 years ago. That's good. I just wonder if you could expand on some thoughts on Hong Kong and the future of the one country, two systems, which seems to be sort of unravelling quicker than people expected.
Yes. Again, it is unravelling in that salami slicing way, although the arrest of the booksellers and the stopping of the Singaporean armoured vehicles sort of stepped over the line. And I think coming from Britain, we've got a problem there because and this is an example of Chinese leverage that I was talking about. We had a couple of years back, before Theresa May came in and Brexit, we had a golden era with China that we were having, whereby it was investing in our nuclear power and our high-speed railway and our God knows what. And this was going to be the future of Britain's economy. That's sort of slowed down, but it has not been officially done. Now we've got Brexit, and we're looking towards India and China for the big trade deals. At the same time, we've got international treaty obligations on Hong Kong, of which we, Britain, are being accused on a constant basis of not upholding. The arrest of the booksellers a few years back is one example. The armoured cars is another. And there's little example, the jailing of the demonstrators and the school curriculum, and that whole sort of slowly, gradually absorbing Hong Kong, not into one country, two systems, one country, one reluctant system that's going on there. Now, I don't know what's going to happen post-Brexit on this, because we are now going to apparently be taking part regularly in the freedom of navigation operations. Quite why we're going to be doing this in the South China Sea when we're needed in the North Atlantic, that issue hasn't been answered, together with the French, and how much we're prepared to forfeit whatever trade deals we're doing with China in order to be part of those freedom of navigation operations. None of that is being debated in Britain because we're completely obsessed with ourselves and Brexit at the moment.
Tom?
Thank you. I'm Tom Reckford with the Foreign Policy Discussion Group. You briefly mentioned Malaysia a few times, but something rather interesting has happened in Malaysia in the last few months. The Najib government fell in the elections. 92-year-old Mahathir has come back and is in charge. He's a fairly prickly character, as we all know, and he's already trying to get Malaysia out from under some of the Chinese investment deals. Is it not possible that he can be a more commanding speaker in terms of the South China Sea issues as well?
I think you're right. He's 92 years old, as long as he stays the course, but I think both of us have been tracking him. I think I first met him in the mid-80s or something. And we were talking about this just before we came in, is there's another issue here, which I think is the leadership. I mean, Mahathir and Lee Kuan Yew took those two countries up to be the Asian miracles and the tigers, and there was that sense of Asian unity, of independence, and an intellectual debate as to what Southeast Asia was. And that, Singapore's kept it, but in Malaysia it disappeared, and it fell into this dreadful sort of corrupt mess of Saudi Arabia and China bailing them out and all the rest of it. And I think Mahathir can, if he stays the course. And what he will do, in a pithy comment, is bring forward an argument that will sum it up for us all. And I think just yesterday he made a very good point about the trade wars and protectionism and everything, and he said it should be done on a Gulf handicap thing, so that a small country would be able to have more protectionism against it than a big country, because that's the state of it is. That is a typical Mahathir comment that rode Malaysia through that thing, and he is prickly, and he was very feisty with us in the 90s, but he's also a good leader.
Right in the middle over here.
Hi, Ida Knox with the American Bar Association Rule of Law Initiative. So I have a question for you. You set up the context with 1839 being where the average Chinese person gets their first idea of Western-based ideals and democracy. And I'm curious for you, with younger generations, the 80s, the 90s, going in with the internet, not to discredit the role that elementary education had in their lives and even university, but I feel like they're getting sort of a more live media narrative of what's coming out of Western democracies right now as the influence on what's forming their ideals. And I'm curious if you think that, like, where you think they should look for that, because my experience with the undefinable average Chinese person is that they see a very negative view of what's coming out of the Western media narrative.
So the last thing that what about the Western media?
So I feel like they don't necessarily see a model when they look at Western democracy right now, and I'm curious, since they're getting that narrative from so many places, where you think they should be looking, either countries or more broadly.
Yeah, I think to encapsulate that quite good, this is in the developing world, I'm going through, and possibly in our world at all, is that in 2003, the Iraq invasion, post that with the Arab Spring, the narrative of Western democracy has been battered. If you put that up against the various statistics of poverty alleviation and the delivery of infrastructure, particularly in Africa, where if you go into any country now, probably the airport and the road is going to have been built by the Chinese. And then you have the debate that's going on. I know the debate that's going on here in the US, and the debate we've got going on about a fractured Europe as to what it is, and the rise of nationalism, the immigration issues, and all that sort of thing. I think that if you're sitting, say, in Ghana or in Mumbai, you're going to be actually looking and saying, well, okay, we had thought that the Queen and Buckingham Palace represented everything that we wanted to be, but that's not the case anymore. But holy Moses, what's over here? And then Xi Jinping is taking advantage of that with some very clever people, educated over here and educated in London, and writing the narrative like he did for the Belt and Road Initiative speech in May last year, and the Davos speech there, where he's actually articulating a vision, and because there is no democracy in that country, his vision is not immediately torn apart on any talk show. So it can get traction on Weibo and WeChat and that sort of thing, and it gets a bit of traction. So I hope that answers your question a little bit there.
And back in the same row.
Hi, my name's Axel Cotilli. I'm with the US Asia Institute. So recently, Japan just lowered the age to vote on constitutional reform. If Japan were to build a full military, how do you think that would affect this issue?
So the constitutional reform here, or?
In Japan.
Oh, in Japan. Yeah, we didn't touch on the... I think that it is going to affect, because whatever happens there is a prospect, say, 10, 15, 20 years from now, that Japan will have a properly deployable military. I think another interesting thing that's happened is that, whether it's part of it or not, since the withdrawal of the US from the Trans-Pacific Trade Partnership, there's been a détente between China and Japan, which you had some very interesting fishing boat photographs, I think, of one year, a couple of years ago, the fishing boats were all up there at these things and there. And talking to people there, what I see unfolding there in a bigger way is that there's a realization that, particularly in Beijing, that if they want to get the US out of the Asia Pacific, Japan has got to feel safe. And if it doesn't feel safe, then it's not going to work. because the key thing that they would want to do in the long term, they certainly don't want to do it now because you get chaos, which they don't like, would be to sever that military relationship. And that means that Asia would have to work out its own route. And it's a big topic, but I think that was since 2012, when the nationalism rise began in Japan, the demonstrations happened, the inward investment from Japan to Beijing dropped by something like 40%. The Senkaku Islands raised up. I think there are people sensible enough on both sides and says, we can't let this escalate any longer, but how are we going to bring it down so that both of us can... there was an interesting written book, I haven't got it here, of somebody describing the rise of Japan in the 1930s, and I played around with it, exchanging Japan for China, and it read pretty much exactly the same. You've got a rising power in Asia against the Western democracy of the US, and how do you deal with that?
Well, let's go right next door. There you go.
Hi, Alex Sanchez. I'm a defense analyst here in DC. One question on the issue of Asian unity. What do you think is the future of ASEAN, like ASEAN? Do you think that bloc has any kind of future? Can they unite to sort of like balance out Chinese influence, or that bloc is just too fragmented? I think like Asian diplomats are going to meet with China, I think next week, right, to discuss for the declaration of conduct conference. What do you think about that meeting as well? Thank you.
The ASEAN bloc.
Yeah, role of ASEAN and the code of conduct talks.
Yeah. I think it's going slowly and incrementally, but I mean, it's good to have it, but it's not. You know, the real issue here is China and the US, and how much the US is going to support ASEAN, or how much China can sort of split the ASEAN thing. I think it's very good to have 10 countries sort of talking amongst themselves to bring in the code of conduct. I don't have a lot of faith in it actually resolving any issue. I think there are a number of organizations like ASEAN, the Commonwealth is another one, that deliberately keep their heads below the parapet because they know what they can achieve and what they can't achieve. And I think this is what's happening with this. It's good to have it. It'll be good to have it, written down and everything, but it's not going to solve the problem. The nub of the problem of the breaking of international law isn't going to be solved.
Right.
Jacob Mendel, College of William and Mary. What's the role of the U.S. in this? There's been the choreographed navigation maneuvers, but then there's also been now the freezing of military exercises with South Korea. Kind of what's the path going forward for the U.S., and is there an ideal path forward for the U.S.? Thank you.
An ideal path for the U.S.? Yeah, the one that works. I mean, the problem that you talk about the freedom of navigation operations or anything could go wrong at any moment. So, in 2001, you had the spy plane accident there, which was a rogue Chinese pilot went too far. I think, and then when those things go wrong, that's when you have to really know how to put in all the safety nets before they escalate. And I think we're getting to a situation now where the freedom of navigation operations are on the increase. France and Britain takes part. Australia, New Zealand are already doing it. As somebody said to me in the book, he said, you've got to be really careful when you're walking your dog down those tracks. You've got to be on bridge-to-bridge communications. And if anything of that, if there's any miscalculation that goes wrong, it can catapult out within seconds. And then when you've got this type of democracies that we have, where you've got the 24-hour chat shows going on, and somebody goes, I mean, I remember this as an example, but it's slightly off here. Right at the beginning of the Syrian war, I was in the studio, and we get in as a presenter's friends, so something had happened. The Syrian war was just starting, and a very senior politician came on with me and the presenter and said, we need to send arms to the Syrian rebels. I said, well, we don't know who they are, we don't know whose side they're on, let's just row back a bit. But that argument got completely swept away, and I think within a week, Britain was sending arms and aid to various rebel groups, and look where we are now. And if you have that sort of thing happening with China on a miscalculation in the South China Sea, I would hate to wargame what would happen going up to the present White House.
Gentleman in the blue shirt here.
Hey, my name is Lei Wing from the Voice of America. I have two questions for you. First of all, let's look at the overall pictures. China has started off from almost nothing in the South China Sea to the point it is today when it has fully militarized its outpost in the South China Sea. So, in your opinion, what underpins China's success in its expanding strategy? Does the U.S. has anything to plan for that? And the second question is, do the U.S. and its allies has any leverage in getting China to respect the rule-based orders in the South China Sea?
So the first one was what will they do next? Essentially, the first question was. I think Greg might agree or disagree with me on this. The Scarborough Shoal is the sort of one that is everybody's talking about, and I've heard the red lines on the Philippines and that, but Scarborough Shoal is obviously strategically placed. They have control over it, and I suspect that at some stage they will do something there. Not at the moment. They're prepared to wait it out, and they're talking about dredging in order for radar to happen there. So I think that's one to watch. And then if you're in Taipei, you're talking about Dongsha Island, where the maritime militia, these are these Chinese fishing boats that are essentially under the control of the PLA, are constantly going in there and testing it. When I was there, they said they had 2 a day often coming in and testing the defenses of Dongsha Island, and that's the one right at the mouth of the South China Sea. And the second question was? Well, that's the problem I think that the US is having. If it wasn't having such a problem with its allies, it wouldn't be welcoming Britain and France from faraway Europe to take part in that. So the India thing I spoke about just now, that when I was talking this in the Philippines, they had then, I'm not sure if it's changed, they had turned down carrying out joint patrols with the Americans because they didn't want, as one buddy said, we don't want the American issues with China to be part of what we're doing. There have been some winding down of small parts of the US-Philippine agreements there. I think everybody's very wary of how far they will go in taking. Vietnam is probably the strongest because there's been a port ship visit there. It's buying radar, Coast Guard vessels and that sort of thing. But you're not getting that front that would be necessary. You're not getting an allied democratic front to say, right, this is what the wall of our values that you have to face.
Second row up here.
Hi, thank you so much for being here today. My name is Caitlin Chung. I'm from the State Department's Bureau of International Security and Nonproliferation. I'd just like to return to the question of Taiwan and ask something about the trilateral relationship between Taiwan, the US, and China. So in 1979, I believe, the US took a very deliberate decision to move away from Taiwan and establish bilateral relationships with China. But then in 2018, with Ma Ying-jeou, who was pro-détente, you see that relationship between the US and Taiwan improving. And with the current president, Tsai Ing-wen, in place, I was wondering if you still saw Taiwan as a very critical strategic place to counter Chinese influence and rising China, or according to your research, do you see that not as useful anymore? And like your response to the earlier question, there isn't a rally democratic force in the South China Sea to counter China. So is Taiwan still very critical in that mission?
I think it is, yeah. I mean, it's a tricky one, but the pressure that China has been putting on Taiwan since Xi came to power, essentially, particularly since the phone call, is immense. And the Taiwanese I speak to actually think that it's just going to keep going. So the semiconductor trade is being squeezed. The tourist, the travel of people from China are only going to KMT areas. They're not going to DPP areas of China. The trade deal. So if, for example, we in Britain wanted to buy or sell something to Taiwan, somebody's going to have a word in somebody's ear and say, well, if you do that, you're going to lose that big aircraft contract or something that you had. So what do we do there? And this is the stuff that is going on here at the moment. I think it's very critical because particularly the military exercises that have started, have been ramped up there. The message that was put over on the military exercises that Singapore and Taiwan have been doing for many, many years, and they suddenly said, well, if you can do that, we're going to confiscate your armored cars coming back. The diplomatic stuff that was going on. And then it was interesting, it's interesting, you talk to, any Chinese now, and Taiwan keeps coming up. So it's in their minds, it's on that, the policy there. The key thing is President Xi hasn't agreed to what's called the consensus, which was the one China policy. She's sort of gone along with old things, but hasn't reaffirmed it, and that has set Beijing's hackles up, as it were.
Thank you.
We have 5 minutes left, and I see 3 questions. 4 questions. Why don't we collect them all?
Okay.
And then we can do a lightning round.
And you can answer them.
Yes. We have, starting in the back here.
Hi, so I'm Connor Scanlon from the University of St. Andrews. This is more of a question from a military perspective. Given the resources that China has to expend to kind of, keep these operations up, to what extent can they really, keep doing it while trying to also balance, I wouldn't say modernizing the military, but keeping up with, the other military powers? Or is this not even something China is really concerned about?
And then the outside of the row here. Gentleman in the blue.
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk on the book on triple waters in South China Sea. Sorry for the my name is Dean Lei from Southeast Asian Sea Foundation, which is a non-governmental research center based in France, created by Vietnamese intellectuals around the world. We speak a lot about the conflict on the sea and the important role of China in this. But the recent situation in Vietnam, the recent days, show that it could affect also the situation on land, means the stability of the countries neighboring the area. As you can know of, there is the decision to go through the special economic zone law in Vietnam by the government that creates a lot of protest and anger inside of the the country by its people. To some extent, the bellicose approach of China, not only on sea but also in economic cooperation, led to a loss of trust by the people in the neighboring countries to the Chinese, to the China as a country, and also to the government of these countries, because they tend not to trust their government, which they seem to be true indulgent to China. So it's rather a comment, but is it something that you discuss also in your book about the risk of instability caused by
and then could you pass the microphone forward? I'll get a question.
I would like to pick your brain on two issues. Number one is recently in a confirmation hearing, Admiral Donaldson have stated, of the Pacific Command have stated that China now has a capability to control the South China Sea in all scenario, short of war with the United States. My question is, can this process be reversed? Number two is that numbers, if not all, Southeast Asian countries, small country there, would seek to use the United States as a counterweight to China. My question to you is, under the present circumstances, what is the wisdom for those countries to continue the search for that kind of counterweight? Thank you.
So, could you repeat the last question again?
The last question is, what is the wisdom of small country in Southeast Asia to seek United States as a counterweight to China expansionism?
What is the reason to assist the United States?
Or the wisdom of trusting the U.S., I guess. So we have 4 questions. Why don't we cut it off there? And you have 1 minute and 2 seconds.
There's no way I'll answer that. The wisdom, I think we'll talk about. I can't answer the questions altogether because I think I'll just say that the wisdom is the focus that we need to put on this. This is the biggest geopolitical challenge that we have faced probably since the Second World War. The Cold War was a challenge for the Second World War, and it comes at a time when our own value system is being questioned. So I appreciate these questions, but I've got to wrap up in about 45 seconds. Essentially, I think we have to understand what is happening here and that it's happening in a different era to the Cold War, to the Second World War, to the League of Nations, to the First World War. It's not 1930s, it's not 1910s, it's not 1960s. It's a different era with different technology and a different power that is coming up that is not necessarily an evil power. And I think in my greatest fear is that we're going to wake up one morning and we're going to find out that Xi Jinping is like Saddam and Assad, and we've just got to go out and remove him and everything's going to be fine in China. And that's going to be a narrative that will stick, because those of us that have followed this, it sticks in many places, and that would be the biggest mistake that we could possibly make. Xi Jinping is not any of those people, and China is not one of those countries. China is very sophisticated, it's got a vision, and I think we need to understand it in order to address it, and hopefully without conflict.
Right. Well, if everybody could please join me in thanking Humphrey for his time. And thank you all for coming out.